The year was 1776. 13 colonies declared their independence from British rule, invoking lofty ideals: freedom, liberty, equality. But beneath the stirring language of Thomas Jefferson's pen lay a brutal contradiction. Jefferson himself owned more than 600 human beings in his lifetime. George Washington, the commander of the Continental Army, enslaved men and women at Mount Vernon. The Constitution that followed a decade later would enshrine slavery without naming it directly, embedding protections for slaveholders in clauses about fugitive persons and population counts. For every call to liberty, there was silence about the whip. From the beginning, the United States was split in two realities. In the North, economic shifts and growing abolitionist sentiment led to gradual emancipation. States like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts began phasing slavery out, motivated partly by industrialization and moral arguments rooted in Christian conscience. But the South had made its choice. It had fertile land, a warm climate, and a product, cotton, that was becoming king. And to harvest it, the South depended on an unpaid, terrorized workforce. Slavery wasn't just a practice, it was a foundation. Even as northern states outlawed bondage, they continued to benefit from it. Banks in New York financed southern plantations. Northern factories processed southern cotton. Ships from Boston carried slave-produced goods across the Atlantic. There was guilt, complicity, and profit on both sides. But socially and politically, the divide widened. Where northern states began to define liberty as incompatible with slavery, southern elites defined liberty as the right to enslave. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was deliberate. Southern leaders spoke of liberty, not as universal freedom, but as protection of their own property, including slaves. They called it a positive good, not just a necessary evil. By the 1830s, pro-slavery ideology had evolved into a full-blown worldview. Blacks were naturally inferior, slavery was ordained by God, and emancipation meant economic ruin and racial chaos. Meanwhile, the North's free black population grew, even as racism remained entrenched. But there was a moral shift underway. Tensions simmered. Every federal debate over tariffs, territories, courts had slavery underneath. When abolitionists mailed anti-slavery pamphlets to the South, they were burned. When runaway slaves escaped to the North, Southern leaders demanded their return. And when voices like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Beecher Stowe gained national attention, they weren't just advocating reform. They were pulling back the curtain on America's founding lie. Southern politicians invoked states' rights often, but their concern wasn't broad constitutional principle, it was specific. They wanted the right to maintain slavery, to expand it, to send federal marshals to free states to retrieve fugitives, to silence abolitionist speech. Their rights ended where black humanity began. This contradiction, born at the nation's founding, became an impossible burden. America could not be both the land of liberty and the land of chains. For nearly a century, leaders tried compromise through law, delay, and moral ambiguity. But the core issue never changed. It was never just tariffs, never just sovereignty. From the beginning, the great unresolved question was this: could a nation built on the ideal of freedom survive while half of it thrived on slavery? The founding generation passed the question forward. The next would be forced to answer it in blood. The 19th century dawned with the nation already trembling along its ideological fault lines. Slavery, once tolerated as a temporary evil even by some of the founders, had become the bedrock of Southern life, culturally, economically, and politically. And as the United States pushed its borders westward, the stakes rose. Each new stretch of land was more than just soil. It was a battlefield for slavery's future. The question was no longer theoretical. It had become a race for control. When the Missouri Territory applied for statehood in 1819, the country faced a crisis. If Missouri entered as a slave state, it would tip the balance of power in Congress. The compromise reached in 1820 allowed Missouri to join as a slave state while Maine entered as free, and a line was drawn across the Louisiana Purchase, above which slavery was banned. But this was no solution. It was a patch, and both sides knew it. The North was growing, in population, in cities, in manufacturing. Immigrants arrived in waves, laboring in factories and swelling the ranks of the urban working class. The South, meanwhile, was exporting more cotton than ever. The invention of the cotton gin had made slavery more profitable, not less. Planters expanded west into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, dragging enslaved people with them through forced marches and internal trade. Families were ripped apart. Resistance through flight, sabotage, or rebellion was met with brutality. Then came Texas. After breaking away from Mexico, a nation that had abolished slavery, Texas joined the Union in 1845. This reignited the sectional fire. Was Texas an outlier or a template? Could the South use new territory to lock slavery in for generations? The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 added vast new lands to the United States. But with that victory came a renewed question. Would slavery be allowed in the new territories? The Compromise of 1850 sought to calm the storm. California entered as a free state, but the South gained a new weapon, the Fugitive Slave Act. It required Northern citizens to help capture and return runaway slaves. Suddenly, the reach of slavery extended deep into states that had outlawed it. Free blacks were kidnapped. Courts rubber-stamped returns. Resistance turned violent. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin appeared in 1852, awakening Northern readers to the realities of bondage. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was flesh and blood. Southern critics branded it fiction, but it touched a nerve. The abolitionist movement grew louder, broader, and more determined. Then came Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed settlers to vote on whether their territory would allow slavery, repealing the Missouri Compromise line. Popular sovereignty, its authors called it. But in practice, it opened the door to chaos. Pro-slavery forces flooded into Kansas, determined to make it a slave state. Anti-slavery settlers responded in kind. Towns burned. People died. The territory earned a new name, Bleeding Kansas. Violence spread beyond the frontier. In 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts was beaten nearly to death on the Senate floor by South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks, enraged over a speech in which Sumner had denounced the slaveocracy. Brooks was hailed as a hero in the South. Sumner became a martyr in the North. The country's political dialogue had collapsed into fists and blood. The Supreme Court delivered its own blow in 1857. In Dred Scott v. Sanford, the court ruled that Black Americans, free or enslaved, were not citizens and had no rights under the Constitution. Worse still, the court declared that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in any territory. The message was clear. Slavery was not just legal. It was protected. The South rejoiced. The North recoiled. A new political force emerged from this turmoil. The Republican Party, founded on opposition to the expansion of slavery. It wasn't yet an abolitionist party, but its platform sent a direct challenge to the South. Slavery would not spread any further. Among its rising stars was a former congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. By the late 1850s, Lincoln was on the national stage. In debates with Senator Stephen Douglas, he made a clear moral argument. Slavery, he said, must be put on a path to extinction, not by force, but by halting its expansion. A house divided against itself cannot stand, he warned. Douglas called for compromise and popular sovereignty. Lincoln warned that compromise had only delayed the inevitable reckoning. In 1859, John Brown, a radical abolitionist, raided a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to incite a slave uprising. He failed. He was captured, tried, and hanged. But in death, he became a symbol. The South saw Brown as proof that the North wanted to destroy their way of life. The North saw him, in part, as a martyr to a cause growing more urgent by the year. When Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, it wasn't because the North had turned abolitionist overnight. Many voters still opposed full equality, but they no longer accepted slavery's expansion. Lincoln's victory sent an unambiguous signal. The political balance had shifted. The South had lost control of the federal government. And to many of its leaders, that meant only one thing: secession. Not because of taxes, not because of tariffs, not because of distant, abstract principles, but because the institution they had built their identity around was now under threat, not just physically, but politically, morally, and symbolically. Within weeks of Lincoln's election, the Union began to break. South Carolina seceded first. Others followed. And in each declaration of secession, they made their reasoning clear, not vaguely but bluntly. Their rights as states had been violated, they said. But the right they meant most was slavery. The war had not yet begun, but the cause had been declared. The tide of secession moved swiftly. One by one, Southern states convened special conventions. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas followed South Carolina out of the Union in a matter of weeks. Each issued declarations or ordinances of secession, and in nearly all, slavery was central. Not as a side issue, not as a secondary grievance, but as the core reason for breaking from the United States. The language they used was unflinching. Mississippi's declaration did not dance around the matter. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. They called it essential to prosperity, to order, to their very existence. These weren't philosophical musings. These were political documents. Just as the Declaration of Independence laid out a list of grievances against King George III, these declarations laid out why secession was necessary. They listed Northern hostility to slavery. They condemned the refusal of some Northern states to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. They pointed to the growing political strength of the Republican Party. At every turn, the grievance was clear. Slavery was under siege. They did not speak of railroad policies. They did not frame secession as a debate about banking or port taxes. They did not claim they were fearful of a despotic government imposing centralized control over their economies. Their concern, repeated over and over again, was that their right to own human beings, to treat them as property, was no longer safe inside the Union. The Confederacy took shape rapidly. By February 1861, delegates from the seceding states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed the Confederate States of America. They wrote a constitution, modeled closely on the U.S. Constitution, but with key differences that exposed the ideological heart of their new government. The Confederate Constitution explicitly protected slavery. It did not use euphemisms. It guaranteed that no law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed. It outlawed any effort to abolish slavery in the Confederate territories. It preserved the foreign slave trade if states desired it. This wasn't a government formed reluctantly. It was one formed with conviction. The Confederacy didn't simply accept slavery. It elevated it, defended it in law, and cast it as the moral backbone of their society. Southern leaders were proud of this foundation. They did not hide it. They promoted it as righteous and necessary. In March 1861, Alexander H. Stephens, the newly appointed vice president of the Confederacy, gave a speech in Savannah, Georgia. Later called the Cornerstone Speech, it laid bare the Confederacy's ideology with brutal clarity. He proclaimed that the old U.S. Constitution had been wrong in assuming all men were created equal. The new Confederate government, he declared, rested upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. Stephens wasn't improvising. He was stating what many Southern leaders believed deeply, that slavery was not only defensible, but divinely sanctioned. Meanwhile, the North watched and waited. President Buchanan, still in office until March, hesitated to act decisively. Lincoln, still president-elect, chose his words carefully. He insisted he had no intention to interfere with slavery where it already existed, but he remained firm that it should not spread. That position, moderate to many Northerners, was intolerable to the South. To them, halting expansion meant surrounding slavery, weakening it, and eventually killing it. They believed Lincoln's policies would lead to demographic isolation, economic suffocation, and cultural marginalization. In April 1861, events came to a head at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The fort, still held by U.S. troops, was surrounded by Confederate forces demanding surrender. When Lincoln ordered a resupply mission, nonviolent, purely logistical, the Confederates opened fire. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. No soldiers died in the attack, but it lit the match. The Civil War had begun. The firing on Fort Sumter unified much of the North. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. In response, for more slave states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, seceded, unwilling to take up arms against fellow Southerners. The lines were now drawn. The Union stood to preserve the nation, the Confederacy to preserve slavery. In the North, motivations varied. Many white Northerners enlisted to defend the Union itself, not yet out of a desire to end slavery. Lincoln's own priority, early in the war, was to save the Union. In 1862, he wrote in a letter, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free." He was walking a tightrope, balancing the radical calls for abolition with the fears of border states still in the Union, where slavery remained legal. But the reality of war began to change the moral terrain. Enslaved people themselves played a role. As Union armies moved into the South, thousands of enslaved men and women fled to the lines, seeking freedom. At first, commanders didn't know what to do. Were they fugitives? Contraband? Soon, Union policy began to treat them as seized property that would not be returned. The war was pulling slavery into its center whether leaders liked it or not. Congress passed laws limiting slavery's reach, banning it in Washington, D.C., outlawing it in the territories, and prohibiting Union officers from returning fugitives. Lincoln, watching carefully, realized that the war could not be won without confronting the institution directly. In 1862, Lincoln prepared the Emancipation Proclamation. After the Union victory at Antietam, he issued a warning. If the Confederacy did not surrender by January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in rebel-held territory would be forever free. The Confederacy, of course, refused. The Emancipation Proclamation took effect, changing the character of the war permanently. It turned the Union Army into a force of liberation. It allowed black men to enlist. It drew a clear moral line. The Confederacy raged. They accused Lincoln of inciting servile insurrection. They warned of race war. But they could not reverse the tide. The cause of slavery, explicit from the start, was now branded into the war's every battle, every campaign, every death. And all of it, from the first secession declaration to the burning cities of war, had flowed from one undeniable fact. Slavery, not tariffs or taxes, was the dividing line. It was not simply a disagreement over governance. It was a struggle for the soul of the nation and for the fate of millions whose labor had built it. As 1863 unfolded, the American Civil War surged into a deeper, bloodier phase. The Emancipation Proclamation had reframed the conflict. No longer could anyone truthfully claim the war was only about preserving a union of states. It was now also about the destruction of slavery, openly, forcefully, and irrevocably. This altered the stakes for both sides. For the Union, it became not only a war to save a political entity, but to end a moral crime. For the Confederacy, it solidified their fight as one of survival, for their independence, yes, but more crucially, for the preservation of a way of life rooted in bondage. Southern leaders knew this. Their rhetoric sharpened, not softened. Confederate President Jefferson Davis denounced the Emancipation Proclamation as a crime against civilization, declaring that it would incite slave rebellion and justify the harshest retaliation. Southern newspapers echoed his fury, warning that black emancipation would lead to societal collapse, racial mixing, and the end of Christian order. The South's commitment to slavery was not diminishing under the pressure of war. If anything, it grew more fanatical. On the battlefield, African American men began joining Union forces by the tens of thousands. Escaped slaves, free black Northerners, and emancipated men all answered the call. They fought at Fort Wagner, at Port Hudson, in dozens of lesser-known battles where the stakes were not only national but deeply personal. They weren't just fighting for a flag. They were fighting for their families, their people, and a future that had never before been promised to them. The North, too, was changing. While racism remained widespread, the reality of black soldiers bleeding for the Union, combined with the visible horrors of Southern slavery brought to light by war, was shifting public opinion. Northern abolitionists, once dismissed as radicals, were gaining broader respect. Their decades of warnings were now playing out in the open fields of battle, where Confederate soldiers fought to protect plantations while their enslaved workers fled or rose up. Lincoln himself evolved. He began speaking more frequently about freedom, not just union. By the time of his Gettysburg Address in November 1863, he no longer spoke of compromise. He honored the dead by redefining the war's meaning, a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could survive. It was no longer merely a military struggle. It had become a national reckoning. Still, the Confederacy fought with unrelenting resolve. And behind their cause remained the unspoken but universally understood truth. Slavery was their foundation. Even as their armies dwindled and cities fell, Confederate officials refused to consider emancipation. Even when military defeat loomed, they refused to arm black men unless it came with a guarantee that they would remain enslaved afterward. Only in the war's final weeks, in sheer desperation, did the Confederate Congress approve the recruitment of black soldiers, with promises of freedom. But by then it was too late. They had built their nation on slavery, refused to abandon it, and were now being buried beneath it. Meanwhile, the Union strategy tightened. General William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea cut through Georgia like a blade. His troops burned plantations, tore up railroads, and freed thousands of enslaved people along the way. Sherman wasn't driven by abolitionism, but he understood that dismantling the Southern economy meant targeting the very system that fueled it, slavery. By 1865, the war was drawing to a close. Richmond fell. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. But Lincoln, who had led the Union through its darkest years, did not live to see the reconstruction of the nation he had helped to preserve. Just days after Lee's surrender, he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer and vocal defender of slavery. Booth's final words as he leapt to the stage at Ford's Theater were telling: "Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants." Booth believed Lincoln had destroyed white Southern liberty by ending slavery. He didn't kill a tyrant. He killed a president who had refused to let the country exist half free and half enslaved. With the war over, the 13th Amendment was ratified, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. It closed the legal door on the practice, but it didn't erase the past. 4 million people were now free, but landless, jobless, and largely unwelcome in the only country they had ever known. The former Confederacy began laying the groundwork for a new system of racial control: black codes, segregation, and the seeds of Jim Crow. The war had broken the chains, but not the mentality that forged them. Yet the myth-making had already begun. Southern politicians, writers, and veterans started spinning a new narrative. The war, they claimed, had not been about slavery. It had been about Northern aggression, about Southern honor, about constitutional principles. They called their cause the Lost Cause, a term that cast the Confederacy as noble and tragic, rather than brutal and wrong. This myth sanitized slavery. It transformed traitors into heroes. And for generations, it shaped how millions of Americans were taught to see the Civil War, not as a war over human bondage, but as a misunderstood family quarrel. But the documents remain. The speeches remain. The battle flags, the declarations of secession, the diaries of enslavers, the scars on black bodies, all remain. They tell a different story, a true story, a story in which the American Civil War was not caused by abstract questions of governance, but by a simple, searing truth. One half of the nation was willing to destroy the other to preserve the right to own people. It wasn't about tariffs. It wasn't about taxes. It wasn't about vague ideals of sovereignty. It was about slavery. Always had been. Always would be. As the guns fell silent in the spring of 1865, the United States faced the daunting task of stitching itself back together. Not just politically, but morally. The Confederate armies had surrendered, but their ideology had not. The nation had defeated a rebellion, but it had not yet dismantled the culture that had given rise to it. The war had clarified the stakes beyond doubt. Slavery was the central cause. Yet even as freedom became law, the debate over what the war was truly about began to twist in public memory. The immediate aftermath of the Civil War saw the federal government take up the massive challenge of Reconstruction. Congress passed the 14th and 15th Amendments, granting citizenship and voting rights to African American men. Former slaves began voting, running for office, and organizing their own communities. For the first time in American history, black men sat in state legislatures, served as sheriffs, and even entered Congress. This brief window, however, was met with swift, violent resistance. Southern whites, unwilling to accept the social changes imposed by war and federal law, turned to terror. Paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, targeting black citizens and white Republicans with lynchings, assassinations, and intimidation. These were not fringe outlaws. They were former Confederate soldiers, local elites, and even elected officials. Their goal was simple: restore white supremacy by any means. The argument shifted again. Now, many former Confederates began recasting their cause. They knew slavery had been central. Every document and speech made that clear. But the shame of defeat and the demands of reintegration pushed them to invent a different memory. They began to say that the war had not been fought for slavery, but for states' rights. They avoided discussing what right the states had sought to protect. They called it Southern independence, resistance to tyranny, or a defense of heritage. This wasn't ignorance. It was deliberate. Former Confederate officers and politicians wrote memoirs and gave speeches that framed their cause as noble and tragic, not brutal and unjust. They celebrated the courage of Confederate soldiers while ignoring the cause for which they fought. The phrase "war between the states" began replacing civil war in Southern schools and literature. Statues went up in public squares, not during the war, but decades later, during the Jim Crow era, as messages of defiance and warnings to black communities. This wave of revisionism became institutional. School textbooks in the South rewrote the war's history, downplaying slavery and casting the North as aggressors. Children were taught that enslaved people had been happy, that the South had been victimized, and that Reconstruction was a period of black incompetence and white suffering. These were not fringe views. They became standard curriculum across many Southern states. Lost cause mythology took root not just in popular culture, but in public policy. At the same time, monuments sprang up, not to mourn the dead, but to honor the Confederate cause. These statues were not erected in the 1860s or 70s, but decades later, during the rise of segregation laws and violent white supremacist movements. In places like Richmond, Atlanta, and New Orleans, towering figures of Lee, Jackson, and Davis stood on pedestals, not as cautionary tales but as revered symbols. No monuments were built for enslaved people. None for Union generals in the South. The public memory was being sculpted, literally and ideologically. Northern complicity played a role. As Reconstruction faltered, many in the North grew weary of the struggle. The political will to enforce civil rights waned. Federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, leaving freed people vulnerable. The Republican Party, once the party of Lincoln and emancipation, began making peace with Southern Democrats to secure political power. The North allowed the South to rewrite history because it was politically convenient. The price was paid by Black Americans. Meanwhile, the phrase states' rights became a political tool once more. It was resurrected not only to defend the Confederacy, but to oppose civil rights in the 20th century. During the 1950s and 60s, as Black Americans fought for desegregation and voting access, Southern leaders again invoked states' rights to resist federal intervention. Governors like George Wallace of Alabama stood in schoolhouse doors, proclaiming that states should decide their racial policies, not Washington. They claimed this was the same principle for which their ancestors had fought. But again, the question remained: the right to do what? It wasn't the right to issue currency. It wasn't the right to build railroads. It wasn't the right to manage fisheries or forests. It was always the right to control race, to maintain slavery, and later, to uphold segregation. States' rights was never the true cause. It was the banner under which slavery marched. Even in the North, this false narrative took hold. Hollywood played a part. Films like The Birth of a Nation, 1915, and Gone with the Wind, 1939, romanticized the antebellum South, depicting loyal slaves, honorable Confederates, and evil carpetbaggers. These portrayals didn't just entertain, they educated. For generations, Americans absorbed a distorted version of their own past, one where slavery was an unfortunate footnote rather than the central engine of conflict. This sanitized history made it easier for Americans to avoid the moral weight of their own story. It allowed the descendants of enslavers to claim pride in their ancestors' valor, while dismissing the horror they defended. It allowed textbooks to speak of differences in lifestyle rather than forced labor. It allowed the monuments to remain unchallenged, standing in courthouses and public squares, speaking the lie in stone. But the truth never disappeared. Historians, Black writers, civil rights leaders, all continued to shout what the records plainly showed. The Confederate cause was the cause of slavery, not peripheral to it, not unrelated, but inseparable. And every time someone invoked states' rights, without answering the question, the right to do what, they were continuing the work of erasure. Even now, the battle over this truth continues, not with bayonets and cannons, but in classrooms, museums, and state legislatures. The fight is no longer to end slavery. It is to remember it honestly, because forgetting is its own kind of war, a war on truth, on memory, and on the dignity of those whose freedom came not as a gift, but as the costliest prize in American history. The Reconstruction era had ended, but its failures cast a long shadow across the 20th century. As Southern states solidified Jim Crow laws and racial terror replaced the whip with the lynch rope, the ideological remnants of the Civil War were never buried. They morphed. They re-emerged under new banners, less direct, but no less rooted in the defense of white supremacy. And still, the echo of states' rights was heard, now used as a shield against progress. As the South institutionalized segregation, it continued to wrap itself in Confederate symbolism. The Confederate battle flag, once a battlefield identifier, became a political symbol, a visible defiance against federal authority, integration, and racial equality. It flew not in 1865, but in the 1950s and 60s, revived by Southern governors, school boards, and citizens who opposed the civil rights movement. It wasn't heritage. It was resistance. And that resistance was built on the very same foundation that had led to war a century earlier: the control of Black bodies and Black lives. The United States Supreme Court's 1954 decision in Brown v. Board of Education declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. It should have been a decisive break from the past. But for many in the South, it was seen as a new version of Northern aggression. Segregationists dusted off the old language. They didn't openly defend slavery anymore, but they once again cried states' rights. They argued that local governments should control their schools, not Washington. They claimed cultural autonomy, educational freedom, and local traditions. But the issue, as ever, wasn't about abstract governance. It was about the right to discriminate. Southern Manifesto signers in Congress made the connection explicit. In 1956, 101 lawmakers signed a statement condemning the court's desegregation ruling. They accused it of disturbing the amicable relations between the races. They didn't use the word slavery, but their logic was inherited from it. They demanded that states retain control over social policy, not because of principle, but because federal enforcement of equality threatened the social order that had survived the Civil War. This theme, repackaging racial control as states' rights, became a recurring pattern. When Black Americans demanded voting access, Southern states imposed poll taxes, literacy tests, and gerrymandered districts, all while claiming the federal government had no authority to interfere. When activists marched in Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham, they weren't just challenging segregation. They were confronting a century of denial, a century of a war whose true cause had been buried under lies. Even as Black veterans returned home from World War II, having fought fascism abroad, they found no democracy waiting for them at home. Southern society still operated under a racial caste system justified by the same logic the Confederacy had used: that Black people were inherently inferior, dangerous if unrestrained, and unworthy of full citizenship. That idea had never been fully discredited because the truth of the Civil War had never been fully accepted. White leaders framed their opposition to civil rights as cultural preservation. They said federal laws threatened their way of life. They claimed the Civil War had been about liberty and self-rule. But liberty for whom? Self-rule to do what? As always, the answers led back to race. The arguments may have evolved, the vocabulary may have softened, but the structure of the ideology remained intact. Control of Black lives must remain in white hands. Popular culture reflected and reinforced these myths. Television shows like The Dukes of Hazzard proudly displayed Confederate flags. High schools named after Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and Stonewall Jackson celebrated Southern valor, while never mentioning the slaves their namesakes fought to keep. In countless towns, the lost cause lived not in dusty books, but in marching bands, school mascots, and courthouse statues. The Confederacy had lost the war, but it had won the memory. And yet, Black Americans never stopped resisting the false narrative. W.B. Du Bois, in the early 20th century, called Reconstruction a splendid failure. Not because it lacked noble aims, but because it was sabotaged. He wrote that the true heroes of the Civil War were not the gray-uniformed generals, but the Black men and women who fought for freedom, first with their feet, then with their labor, and finally with their votes. He and others preserved the truth, even as textbooks denied it. The civil rights movement of the 1960s forced another national reckoning. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. demanded not only legal rights, but historical honesty. He made it clear that America's original sin, slavery, had not been washed away by war. It had simply changed form. And the fight for justice was not just about law, but about memory. By the end of the 20th century, more Americans began to confront the deeper roots of the Civil War. Scholarship pushed back against the lost cause mythology. New museums, like the National Museum of African American History and Culture, began to center the voices of those who had been enslaved. Public discourse shifted, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably, toward truth. Still, the backlash came just as swiftly. In the 2010s, as movements like Black Lives Matter rose, the symbols of the Confederacy came under renewed scrutiny. Cities debated whether to remove statues. School boards questioned curriculum. Some states finally lowered the Confederate flag from government buildings. And once again, defenders of the old order raised the banner of heritage, of tradition, of states' rights. But the pattern was all too familiar. The issue, once again, wasn't about rights broadly, but about defending a historical narrative that masked oppression as honor. Charlottesville, 2017. White supremacists marched to defend a statue of Robert E. Lee. They chanted, "You will not replace us." They carried torches, Confederate flags, and Nazi symbols. A woman was murdered. And even then, some leaders hesitated to name the ideology for what it was. The legacy of the Civil War wasn't buried. It was alive, violent, and standing in plain view. The true story of the Civil War is not complicated. The Confederacy was formed by men who stated, in their own words, that they seceded to protect slavery. Their Constitution enshrined it. Their leaders defended it openly. Their armies fought for it. Everything else, tariffs, culture, sovereignty, was secondary, a smokescreen. And the repeated invocation of states' rights was, and always has been, a cover for something else, the right to deny others their humanity. To accept this truth is not to hate the South or erase history. It is to honor it fully. It is to stop telling children that the war was a tragic misunderstanding. It was a moral clash between freedom and bondage, between equality and hierarchy, between democracy and human chattel. The United States did not nearly destroy itself over taxes. It nearly destroyed itself because half of it refused to give up the right to enslave. The decades after the Civil War did not bring national unity in memory, only a fragile political reunion layered with deep cultural fracture. The Confederacy had lost the war militarily, but in many parts of the country, especially the South, it reshaped the narrative to win the peace ideologically. That effort over generations ensured that the foundational cause of the conflict, slavery, was buried beneath euphemisms, sentimentality, and false nobility. This distortion wasn't harmless. It helped lay the groundwork for 150 years of structural inequality and racial violence. In the early 20th century, as the United Daughters of the Confederacy and other organizations promoted the lost cause version of history, Confederate symbols were embedded in daily life. Public schools were named after Confederate generals. City parks flew battle flags. Courthouses stood under the gaze of Confederate statues. This was no organic cultural remembrance. It was a systematic effort to shape minds. Textbooks were rewritten to depict slavery as benevolent and Black resistance as savagery. Generations of white Southerners were taught not to remember the war, but to misremember it carefully. And generations of Black Americans were forced to live under the myth that their ancestors' bondage was a detail, not the point. These myths reached into national politics. Presidents, senators, governors. Many avoided the subject of slavery when referencing the Civil War, speaking instead of brother against brother, as if it were merely a tragic misunderstanding. But Black Americans had no such luxury. For them, history was not a metaphor. The war had not been about abstractions. It had been about life and death, chains and freedom. And when the war ended, the promise of liberty was not fulfilled. It was deferred, delayed, and in many places denied. The rise of segregation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was not a new system. It was a continuation of the old. Black codes became Jim Crow. Slave patrols became modern policing in the South. Denial of education, economic opportunity, and justice continued, not in defiance of history, but because the true history had been buried. Every time a Black citizen passed under a Confederate statue to enter a courthouse built in the age of segregation, the message was clear. The old power still stood. And yet, truth endured. Black scholars, writers, and community leaders refused to let the lie stand unchallenged. From W.E.B. Du Bois to Carter G. Woodson, they preserved the memory of Black resistance, the cruelty of slavery, and the truth of the war's cause. Their voices were often excluded from mainstream education, but they built a counter-narrative that would later inspire civil rights movements. By the 21st century, the facade began to crack. Historians overwhelmingly agreed. The war had been about slavery. Not states' rights in the abstract, not tariffs, not misunderstood governance, but the explicit, documented, proudly declared intention of Southern states to protect, expand, and perpetuate slavery. Their own secession declarations confirmed it. Their own leaders declared it. Their own constitution enshrined it. Yet public memory lagged behind. In polls, many Americans still claimed the war was mostly about states' rights. Statues still stood. School children still learned a diluted version of the truth. And Confederate flags still flew, not just on government buildings, but on bumper stickers, T-shirts, and at political rallies, often defended as symbols of heritage. But what heritage, exactly? When Dylan Roof walked into the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston in 2015 and murdered 9 Black worshippers, he wasn't carrying a states' rights manifesto. He was carrying a Confederate flag. He had been radicalized by white supremacist lies that cloaked racism in historical revisionism. His hatred was not new. It was an extension of a century and a half of refusing to confront the truth. The nation reacted. Flags were lowered. Statues came down. Debates intensified. Some cities voted to rename schools and remove monuments. Others passed laws to protect them. The conversation shifted, but the resistance remained. Those who defended the monuments did so in familiar language: heritage, tradition, pride. But they rarely answered the central question. Heritage of what? Whose tradition? Pride in what cause? To confront the true history of the Civil War is to strip away these comfortable half-truths. It is to admit that the Confederacy did not rise for noble sovereignty, but for a cruel and calculated defense of slavery. It is to admit that generations of Americans were lied to about their own past. It is to understand that what we remember, and how we remember it, has consequences. That's why the legacy of the war still matters. Not because it's about antique flags or bronze statues, but because it shaped the American racial order that still endures. The war was fought to end slavery, but slavery left behind its ghost. In prisons, in policing, in housing, in voting, in wealth. The question is not whether we remember the war. It's how we remember it, and whether we have the courage to finally tell the truth, not for shame, but for justice. To continue the story of the Civil War's long shadow, one must look beyond the battlefields and monuments to the legal structures, political tactics, and cultural institutions that carried forward the conflict's central theme: racial hierarchy, well into the 20th and 21st centuries. The Confederate defeat had ended slavery by law, but it did not end the belief system that justified it. That belief system, white supremacy, adapted itself to new forms, rooting itself in every corner of American life under new names, but always with the same objective: to deny equality. After 1865, the 13th Amendment ended slavery, but with a fatal loophole. It permitted involuntary servitude as a punishment for crime. Southern states seized upon that clause. They began passing black codes, laws specifically crafted to criminalize black life. Vagrancy, loitering, or speaking too loudly could lead to arrest. Once convicted, black men were leased to private companies, forced to work without pay under brutal conditions in what became known as the convict leasing system. These were not isolated incidents. This was systemic, the legal rebirth of slavery under another name. Plantations became prisons. Chains were exchanged for handcuffs. Cotton fields became labor camps run by sheriffs instead of overseers. And the ideology behind it all, the belief in black inferiority and white control, was not abandoned after Appomattox. It was merely renamed law and order. In the political sphere, this same ideology shaped governance. Southern states, despite having lost the war, quickly regained political power by disenfranchising black voters. Literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and outright violence were used to erase black political participation. These efforts weren't rogue operations. They were written into law, enforced by courts, and protected by federal neglect. Every time black Americans tried to assert their rights, during Reconstruction, during the Great Migration, during the Civil Rights era, they were met with the full weight of systems designed to keep them out. And at every stage, the justification sounded familiar: states' rights. The same argument that had defended slavery now defended segregation, voter suppression, and inequality. Education was no exception. Black schools, where they existed, were underfunded, overcrowded, and underserved. Textbooks often excluded slavery entirely or whitewashed it as a benign institution. White children learned that the South had fought for honor. Black children learned that their history didn't matter. And yet, despite these obstacles, black teachers, parents, and students fought to reclaim their narrative, building schools, writing their own curricula, and preserving oral histories that would one day challenge the myths written in stone. Culture, too, became a battleground. In literature, in film, in public ceremonies, the Civil War was transformed from a conflict over slavery into a tale of noble Southern resistance. Films like Gone with the Wind glorified plantation life while minimizing or romanticizing slavery. Confederate soldiers were depicted as tragic heroes, while Union forces were shown as villains or aggressors. The enslaved were silent, loyal, or absent entirely. These portrayals mattered. They didn't just entertain, they educated. They helped sustain the lie that the war had not really been about slavery. And when challenged, defenders of these myths returned again to the fallback position: states' rights, heritage, tradition. But the evidence was always there. In archives, in speeches, in letters, in laws, the Confederacy made its purpose explicit. Southern leaders didn't hide their motives. They published them. They spoke them aloud. Alexander Stephens, Jefferson Davis, and countless state delegates proclaimed without apology that their cause was slavery. To deny that now is not only dishonest, it's a rejection of history itself. And still, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, efforts to obscure that truth continue. In recent years, states have passed laws banning the teaching of divisive concepts in schools, laws that often target lessons about race, slavery, and systemic inequality. Teachers are punished for telling the truth. Books are banned. And once again, the language of freedom is used to defend the erasure of history. But this time, more Americans are pushing back. Descendants of enslaved people are reclaiming their ancestors' stories. Historians are uncovering long-buried truths. Museums and cultural institutions are refusing to sanitize the past. The narrative is shifting, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. The lie is being confronted with truth, not vengeance. With facts, not myths. With dignity, not denial. And what becomes clear over and over again is that the Civil War was not just a historical event. It was a beginning. A beginning of a long, unfinished struggle to reconcile America's promise with its practice. A war launched to preserve slavery did not end with its abolition. Its consequences have echoed through every generation since, shaping not only race relations, but the very definition of American freedom. To say the Civil War was about states' rights is to ask the wrong question. The real question, the enduring one, is this: what did those states want the right to do? The answer is found not in rhetoric, but in records. And the answer again and again is slavery. The right to own, sell, beat, and breed human beings. The right to build a society where freedom existed only for some and bondage for the rest. That is what they fought for. That is what they defended. And that is why the truth still matters. In the wake of renewed historical clarity, the final and perhaps most difficult battlefield remains the American conscience. How this nation chooses to internalize, teach, and live with the truth about its Civil War. This war was not a closed chapter. It was the opening salvo in a centuries-long struggle over power, humanity, and memory. Its consequences are alive in the laws that govern, the institutions that shape opportunity, and the silence that often still surrounds its cause. The modern political arena is not divorced from this legacy. The language of freedom and liberty continues to be employed selectively, often to resist equity, not promote it. The framework once used to justify secession has resurfaced in debates over everything from voting rights to education. When voting restrictions target minority communities and are defended with arguments about local control, we see echoes of the past. When school boards ban lessons on slavery's brutal realities and call it parental choice, we hear the ghost of the same rationalizations that buried the truth of the war under the myth of honor. The myth still persists in more than just words. Across the American South and far beyond, military bases, high schools, and even streets bear the names of men who fought to preserve slavery. These names are not trivial. They are daily affirmations of whose stories the nation has chosen to honor and whose it has chosen to forget. A child walking into a school named after Robert E. Lee does so under a shadow, whether they realize it or not. That shadow stretches back to a cause that explicitly rejected their freedom if they are Black, and their equality if they are not. Yet when efforts are made to rename these institutions, or to remove statues that honor Confederate leaders, the opposition still borrows from the same rhetorical arsenal. Heritage, history, don't erase the past. But these monuments were never about preserving the past. They were about asserting dominance in the present. Nearly all were erected not immediately after the war, but during moments of Black political assertion. The Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights Movement, and more recently in reaction to demands for racial justice. They were not memorials. They were messages. They declared that despite military defeat, the ideology of the Confederacy was not gone. They warned Black citizens not to overstep, not to forget their place. And they reassured white citizens that their supremacy was still institutional, sanctioned, and public. And still, despite these obstacles, resistance never ceased. Black Americans, who had everything to lose, fought to make America live up to its stated ideals. From the first enslaved Africans who resisted bondage to the foot soldiers of the Civil Rights Movement, their struggle has always been not only for rights, but for truth. They refused the comfort of myth. They preserved the facts others tried to erase. This perseverance led to real victories. Laws were changed. Voters registered. Truth commissions formed. Statues came down. But the work is not finished. Because while the monuments of stone can fall in a day, the monuments of thought, the myths etched into culture, identity, and belief, are harder to dismantle. And this is why historical accuracy is not just academic, it's political. How a nation remembers determines how it legislates, how it educates, how it governs. Memory is power. And those who have tried to reshape the memory of the Civil War into a story of noble loss rather than a moral rebellion have done so with full awareness of what they stood to gain. The perpetuation of inequality, the justification of modern injustices, the denial of responsibility. In every era since 1865, the battle over that memory has been renewed. During the Great Depression, when Black laborers were excluded from New Deal programs. During World War II, when Black soldiers fought fascism abroad and faced segregation at home. During the Cold War, when America claimed to be the leader of the free world while lynchings continued in the South. And today, as debates over systemic racism are dismissed by some as divisive rather than urgent. The legacy of the Civil War lives in these contradictions. And until the cause of that war is accepted, not as an unfortunate detail, but as the central defining issue, its consequences will remain. Because if America cannot say plainly that the war was fought over slavery, it cannot confront why racism persists. If it cannot admit that secession was about preserving human bondage, It cannot understand why inequality is systemic. If it continues to call the Confederacy a proud part of our heritage, it cannot teach its children the cost of denying others their humanity. And yet there is hope. More people than ever are seeking the truth, even when it's painful. Educators are fighting to teach it. Artists are reimagining how history is told. Descendants of enslaved people are reclaiming their family stories. Museums are centering voices that were once excluded. Cities are choosing honesty over nostalgia. This isn't about guilt, it's about growth. A nation does not become weaker by facing its sins. It becomes stronger. Acknowledging that the Civil War was fought to defend slavery does not diminish the valor of the soldiers. It clarifies the cause. It does not tarnish Southern identity. It separates culture from injustice. And it does not rewrite history, it corrects it. In the end, the war's truth will not be silenced. It is written in the letters of Confederate politicians who named slavery as their reason for rebellion. It is carved into the documents that founded the Confederacy. It is spoken in the words of enslaved people who fled to Union lines, fought in Union uniforms, and lived to see the chains broken. It is evident in every injustice that followed, built on a foundation of denial. To honor that truth is not just to tell a better story. It is to become a better country.